Wyoming Territory, 1884. The wind came down from the hills cold and sharp, curling dust around the boots of a lone rider as he crossed the edge of Laramie's Main Street. Asher McCrae reined in his sorrel gelding near the general store, his hat pulled low against the wind. He had come in for supplies before heading back to his remote homestead, 2 days' ride south. But what caught his eye was not the storefront or the wagon load of dry goods being unloaded, but the girl sitting on the corner of the boardwalk with a tin box in her lap. She could not have been more than 20. Her dress was worn at the knees, boots scuffed near through, and her hair dark as riverstone was pulled back in a loose braid. She sat cross-legged on the cold wood, a small folded cloth beside her holding an assortment of buttons, not new ones. Most were mismatched, some with thread still clinging to the holes. "Buttons, sir?" she asked softly, offering up the tin box. "5 for a cent." He stepped down from his horse and studied her. She did not beg, she did not look away. Her voice was clear, but there was something hollow in it. Not weakness, just the kind of tired that sinks into the bones. "Ma'am," Asher said, tipping his hat. "You out here on your own?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I'm alone." He crouched down, resting one knee on the wood, his voice low. "Not anymore." Her eyes met his, then storm-colored, wide but wary. He saw hunger there, but not only for food. She looked like someone who had not been seen in a long time. "I'm Asher McCrae," he said gently. "You got a name?" "Zadie," she said after a pause. "Zadie Zimmerman." He nodded. "You eaten today, Zadie?" She shook her head once. "Yesterday I had half a biscuit, day before a little apple." His jaw clenched. He stood and held out a hand. "Come on, let's get you warm. You can eat, then tell me how you ended up here." She hesitated, but her fingers closed around his. Her hand was cold, skin dry and cracked. He led her into the saloon, where the fire was burning steady and the stew pot always simmered behind the bar. Zadie sat stiffly in the corner as Asher ordered food. When the bowl of stew and bread arrived, she stared at it for a moment before lifting the spoon. She ate slowly, like she was afraid of finishing too fast. She never looked up until the bowl was empty. He waited until she set the spoon down before he spoke. "Where are your people, Zadie?" She looked at the fire. "My father died last spring. He was a tailor in Kansas City. After he passed, my stepmother sold the shop and left me with nothing. I tried to find work, but no one wants a girl with no skills but sewing. I headed west with a traveling family, but they left me behind in Cheyenne. I walked from there, found buttons in the dirt on discarded clothes. I thought maybe someone traded for them." She gave a faint, embarrassed shrug. "I was wrong." Asher leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You got nowhere to go." "No," she said, her voice small. "No one left." He did not speak for a moment, then simply, "You do now." She looked up sharply. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Do not need to," he said. "I saw a girl sitting in the cold, trying to trade broken buttons for bread. That tells me all I need." Her eyes filled, but she blinked them dry. "I'm not looking for charity. I'm not offering it," he said. "I have a cabin, land, and too much quiet. You want shelter and work, you can have both. You sew, you cook, you keep your pride. I will not take that from you." She stared at him, searching for the catch. But there was none. Just a cowboy with calloused hands and steady eyes offering her a place in the world again. After a long silence, she nodded. "All right," she said. "I'll come." They left town before sunset. Zadie rode behind him, arms wrapped around his waist. Asher spoke little on the trail, but he made sure she had his blanket when the cold set in and started the fire quick when they made camp. That night they sat beside the flames, sipping coffee from tin cups. She watched him across the firelight. "You really live all the way out here alone?" she asked. "I do," he said. "Parents died when I was 16. I took the land after the war, never married." Never found someone who felt like home. She looked down at her hands. You think I could be that? He raised his head, eyes soft but sure. I think you already are. There was silence between them, but it was not cold. It was full of something growing. She did not speak again until they had laid down to sleep. He gave her the bedroll, took the ground beside her. In the dark, she whispered, "Thank you." His voice came back warm. "You are not alone, Zadie. Not anymore." And that night, for the first time in many months, she slept without fear. The wind shifted sometime after dawn, carrying the scent of pine and old snow down from the peaks. Zadie woke wrapped in wool and silence, the fire reduced to embers. Asher stood a short distance off with his back to her, pouring water into the blackened tin pot. His shoulders moved with a slow steadiness as he built the morning fire back up, coaxing it to life with careful breath and dry bark. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, watching the way his coat hung off one shoulder. It had slipped sometime in the night, and she could see the edge of a scar across his upper arm, long, faded, like something left behind a long time ago. "Was that from the war?" she asked, her voice rough from the cold air. He glanced back. "Yeah," he said, crouching to adjust the pot. "Shiloh." She didn't know where that was, but the name sounded heavy. "You get hurt bad." "Bad enough," he said, "but I walked away." She nodded, drawing the blanket tighter around her. "You always cook for two, even when you're by yourself." He lifted the pot with a leather-wrapped hand, setting it onto the flames. "No, just figured you'd be hungry again." "I am," she said quietly, then hesitated. "I know you said I could help with things." "What needs doing today?" "We'll ride the last hour to the cabin," he said. "Then there's water to haul. Coop needs mending. You can take the back room if you want it." She folded the blanket and set it by the pack. "I'm not afraid of work. I just never had a place to do it in." He didn't answer right away. The fire popped, loud in the hush between them, and a raven called from somewhere along the ridge. He handed her a tin cup of boiled coffee once it had steeped long enough. "You got a way of speaking like you're expecting someone to take things away." Zadie looked into the cup. "That's how it's always gone." "Well," he said, sitting cross-legged across from her, "I don't take what ain't offered." She met his eyes. "And if I offer," he didn't look away, "then I don't waste it." They rode through the last stretch with the sun climbing behind them, the land opening up to tall grass and low hills. Asher's place sat tucked in a shallow draw, protected from wind by a rise of rock and timber. The cabin was small but solid, smoke curling from the chimney and a lean-to shelter off one side for the animals. "This is yours?" she asked, sliding down stiffly from the horse. "Built it when I was 22, he said. "Took 3 winters to get it right." She followed as he led the gelding to the corral, uncinching the saddle and brushing down the animal's flanks with short, practiced strokes. The inside of the cabin smelled of pine and beeswax. A narrow cot occupied one wall, shelves above it lined with jars of dried herbs and preserves. Near the hearth sat a table with 2 chairs and a carved wooden box with initials burned into the lid EM. Worn and faded, Asher caught her eye. "That was my mother's." Zadie nodded, not asking more. She could tell from the way he touched the box when he passed it that the story behind it didn't belong to that morning. He showed her the back room, where a bed frame stood empty beneath a small window. The light coming through it was soft, filtered by the high clouds rolling in. "It's plain," he said, "but warm." "It's kind," she replied. "That's more than I've had." After stowing her things, what little there was, she came out with the sleeves of her blouse rolled up. "You said the coop needs mending." He stepped back from the hearth where he'd been setting a kettle to boil. "Boards are stacked by the barn, hammers on the peg." She found the boards and worked through the afternoon. Her stitches were fine, but her hammering was not. After the 3rd bent nail, She laughed under her breath and tried again. Asher came out with a length of twine and helped her brace the frame upright. He didn't correct her, just steadied the post while she drove the nail in. "You're patient," she said, brushing hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "You're trying," he said. "That counts more." They finished with the last of the daylight, the wind quieting as the sun dipped behind the hills. Inside, he cooked beans with salt pork and she set the table without being asked. They ate slow. The cabin held the warmth well, and the quiet between them was no longer uncomfortable. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked once the dishes were stacked. "Sometimes," he said. "But it's not the place that was empty, just me." She folded her hands in her lap. "You don't feel that way now?" He looked at her across the table, his voice low. "Not anymore." She didn't answer him then, just stood and picked up the kettle to pour water into the basin. He watched her as she moved unhurried, steady, like she belonged there already. Later, when the lantern was turned down and the fire burned soft, she stood in the doorway of the back room. "I'm not good at trusting," she said, voice barely above the crackle of the coals. He didn't move from his chair. "Then don't rush it," she nodded once. "Good night, Asher." "Good night, Zadie." She closed the door behind her. He stared at the fire for a long time after, the sound of wind in the chimney the only thing that moved. Neither of them dreamed that night. They were too full of something real. Zadie stood beneath the eaves of the lean-to as early light crept over the ridge. Her hands were red from the pump out back, but the water in the basin steamed against the morning air, and that felt like a small victory. A pot of oats sat warming on the stove inside, but she lingered outside, watching frost melt from the fence rails. Asher emerged from the barn, pulling his coat closed with one hand, a bundle of kindling tucked under the other. His boots left dark impressions in the frostbitten grass. "You always up before the sun?" she asked, not turning as he approached. "Old habits," he said, setting the wood by the door. "You sleep all right?" "I did," she said. "Woke once. Thought I heard someone speak." "Likely just the wind," he said, brushing his gloves off on his thigh. "It catches strange through the draw sometimes." She gave a small nod. "You ever get lonely out here?" He looked at her, the way her braid had started to come undone, how she kept her arms folded like she didn't quite believe she was allowed to be still. "Loneliness isn't the same when someone else is breathing beside your fire," he said. She glanced up at him, one eyebrow raised, but her mouth softened. Inside, she poured the oats and he fetched a crock of honey from the shelf. They ate standing, neither of them much for lingering that morning. "I've been thinking," she said, looking down into her bowl. "You have a spare room and I've got sharp eyes. If you'd let me, I could mend for folks. You could take goods to town and bring back orders." He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, spoon in hand. "You want to work, I want to earn," she said. "You gave me shelter, I can give something back," he nodded. "All right. You write up what you need: thread, needles, cloth, and I'll see what I can get on my next supply run." She smiled down at her bowl, a quick thing she didn't try to hide. "Thank you." The rest of the day passed in steady rhythm. She cleaned the shelves in the back room and sorted the few pieces of fabric she'd salvaged from her satchel. He worked with the axe out front, splitting pine into stackable lengths for next month's cold. When the sun dipped low, she brought him a tin cup of warmed cider. "You ever think about building on?" she asked, watching him toss a finished log onto the pile. He wiped the back of his wrist across his brow. "What for?" "Well," she said, taking a sip, "if you take on more stock or if that coop ever turns into a proper henhouse, you'll need more space." He studied her a moment, then set the axe down slow. "You planning on staying long enough to see that happen?" She met his gaze. "I'd like to." He nodded once, quiet and sure. That evening, after supper, she brought out the tin of buttons. She spread them on the table, arranging them in rows by size. "You still mean to trade these?" he asked, watching her hands move. "No," she said, "but I want to keep them. They got me here." He reached across, touching the largest one, a brass piece with a star etched faintly in the middle. "This one's from a cavalry coat." She looked up, surprised. "You recognize it?" "My brother wore one like it when he rode dispatch," he said. "Didn't come back." She didn't speak, just reached over and slid the button across to him. "Then it belongs to you." He closed his fingers around it, slow. "Thank you." The fire burned low again, but neither of them made to stir it. They sat with the quiet between them, not empty this time but settled, like the silence of a field after harvest. "What was your father like?" he asked. She took a breath, eyes on the coals. "He had a laugh that shook the floorboards. He used to hum while he worked, never sang, just this low sound like he was talking to the cloth." Asher smiled, but not with his mouth. "Sounds like a good man." "He was," she said. "He'd have liked you." They didn't need to say more. Outside, the wind had settled and the stars were beginning to show over the ridge. He stood and added a log to the fire before turning back to her. "You warm enough in there?" "I am," she said, rising with her cup. "But if it's all right, I think I'll sit out front a while." "Watch the sky," he nodded. "I'll join you." They stepped outside, boots quiet on the packed earth. She sat on the edge of the porch and he beside her, not quite touching, above them. Stars blinked into being, one after another, like someone lighting lamps across the sky. "I used to think the stars were fixed," she said. "But they shift, don't they?" "They do," he said, "bit by bit." She tilted her head toward him. "Feels like I'm shifting too." He looked over, voice low. "Toward what?" She held his gaze. "Something solid." And he reached out, slow and without demand, until his fingers brushed hers where they rested on the porch rail. She didn't pull away. They sat that way a long time. The land stretched quiet and wide around them, and the distance between two hearts closed by hand, not words. By mid-November, snow began to stick in the shaded spots, and the trail behind the cabin turned to frozen earth beneath the horses' hooves. Zadie had taken to wearing one of Asher's older coats, sleeves rolled twice and still falling past her wrists. She didn't mention it, and neither did he. She'd built up a modest stock of mended goods, patched trousers, cleaned-up blouses with new buttons, a few hand-stitched kerchiefs dyed with walnut husks. She kept them folded in a cedar box beside her cot, taking quiet pride in how neat the seams looked under the morning light. Asher had started leaving for town every other Friday before sunrise, returning by dusk with flour, lamp oil, and news. Zadie stayed behind, tending the stove and keeping the livestock fed. It surprised her how natural that rhythm felt, not like waiting, but like keeping a place warm for someone who would always return. That afternoon, she stood barefoot on the cabin floor, oiling the wooden table legs with beeswax and a rag. Her braid had come loose again, hanging in a thick rope down her back. Asher came in with his coat dusted white at the shoulders, the scent of snow sharp in his clothes. He held a small parcel wrapped in brown cloth. "From Mrs. Holt," he said, placing it on the table. "She said your stitching's better than what she gets out of Cheyenne." Zadie wiped her hands, then unwrapped the bundle. Inside were 2 worn shirts and a beaded collar with a tear along the edge. "She wants this one fixed before Christmas," he added. Zadie turned the beaded piece over in her fingers, examining the break. "I'll need finer thread." "I brought some," he said, setting a spool beside her. "Figured you'd ask." She looked up. "You always this prepared?" He reached for the kettle. "Not before you." She smiled, folding the cloth back around the shirts. "I'll have them done in 4 days." He didn't doubt her. That night, clouds pressed low over the valley, and the wind carried the distant sound of elk moving through the timber. Asher sat cross-legged near the hearth, mending a cracked stirrup with a length of rawhide while Zadie laid out her needlework by the lamplight. She didn't speak for a while, her fingers sorting through beads with careful precision. Then, without looking up, she asked, "You ever think about what comes next?" He paused, twisting the leather in his hands. "You mean after winter?" She nodded once. "I mean after this part, after the quiet." He set the stirrup aside. "I've thought about building another room. Something with more light, maybe a place to work indoors." She met his eyes. "You think I'll still be here come spring?" He didn't blink. "I'd like you to be." Zadie breathed in through her nose, slow and steady. "I've never stayed anywhere longer than a season. My father used to say I was born with my boots pointed toward the door." "Well," he said, voice low, "you haven't had a place worth staying in." She set down the collar and crossed her arms on the table. "If I stay, it won't be just for shelter, I know." They listened to the fire for a while, its snap and crackle the only sound. "I'm not scared of work," she said, "or the cold or being out here. But I am scared of becoming part of something and losing it again." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I can't promise nothing will ever change, but I can promise I won't leave unless you send me." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I wouldn't." He stood then slowly and crossed to her side of the table. She rose to meet him, her hands still inked faintly with dye, her eyes steady. He didn't touch her at first, just stood close enough for her to feel the heat of him, the scent of pine and leather clinging to his shirt. "I'm not asking for everything tonight," he said, "but I'd be proud to build a life with you, one step at a time." Zadie laid her palm against his chest, right over the place his heart beat slow and sure. "Then let's start with tomorrow." "That's enough for me," she nodded, and he kissed her then, gentle, certain, without urgency. The kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything but offered everything. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. "I never thought I'd find something like this." "You didn't find it," he said. "You made it." That night she didn't sleep in the back room. She curled beside him beneath the heavy quilt, her hand tucked beneath his, the fire casting soft gold across the rafters. The wind moved through the pines outside, but inside the cabin, everything held. And for the first time in either of their lives, tomorrow didn't feel uncertain. It felt like a promise. By late December, the cabin stood hushed under a thick quilt of snow, the fields beyond white as bone and still as sleep. A narrow trail of wood smoke curled from the chimney, and inside, the warmth held close to the walls, scented with pine resin and the faint sweetness of dried apples strung above the hearth. Zadie sat cross-legged on the floor near the fire, bent over the beaded collar she'd nearly finished. The fine thread Asher had brought from town held true, and her needle moved confidently through the final row. She didn't hum, but a quiet contentment hung around her like a shawl. Asher had taken to reading aloud in the evenings, his voice low and steady, pacing through the worn pages of a borrowed volume of natural philosophy. Not because she needed the knowledge, but because she liked the sound of him speaking long after the work of the day was done. That afternoon, as the light turned amber and began to lean toward evening, he came in from the barn carrying a bundle of fresh-cut cedar. Snow clung to the hem of his trousers, and he shook it off at the door before stepping inside. Zadie looked up. "You planning to build something?" He set the wood down beside the stove. "A cradle." Her breath caught just for a blink. He crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You didn't say anything," he said gently. "But I've seen the way you touch your belly when you think I'm not looking." She set her work aside and laid her hand over his. "I wasn't sure how to tell you. You just did," he said. "And I'm glad." She leaned her forehead against his. "I was afraid it would change things." "It already has," he said. But not the way you mean. The fire crackled beside them, casting their shadows long across the floorboards. She took his hand and placed it against her stomach, where no curve had shown yet, but something new and fragile stirred beneath. He didn't speak for a long while. When he did, it was with a reverence she hadn't heard before. "I'll build more than a cradle." The days that followed passed in a rhythm that felt older than either of them. He carved cedar into smooth arcs and joints, the scent of it clinging to his clothes. She worked slower now, resting more often, but her fingers still moved with purpose. Letters began to arrive from town, orders from neighbors she'd never met, passed along by word of mouth. A woman who could mend beadwork and patch trousers with the same care. One morning, thick with frost, Asher returned from the river with a bundle of fish wrapped in wool and a small ring tucked into his coat pocket. He didn't say much when he came in, just set the fish to soak and pulled Zadie into the crook of his arm. "I want you to have something made for keeping," he said, drawing out the simple brass band. "A promise that doesn't wear through." She turned it over in her hand, then slipped it onto her finger. "You didn't need to ask." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." They stood by the stove, the fire warm behind them, her head resting against his shoulder. The snow began to melt in March, slow and steady, revealing patches of earth and the first signs of green at the edges of the ridge. The coop held strong, and the hens had taken to nesting again. Zadie laughed the first time she found 3 eggs tucked in a corner, her palm cradling them like tiny, warm stones. Asher added a second room onto the cabin by early May, with a wide window that opened toward the east. It became her sewing space, and sometimes, when the wind was quiet, she sat there barefoot, stitching while the light poured in. The baby came in late August, just as the sun began to soften and the nights grew cool again. A girl, small and dark-haired, with Zadie's mouth and Asher's quiet brow. They named her Aloan, after a word Zadie's father had once used for light through leaves. Asher held her close that first night, his hand covering nearly her whole back. He didn't speak much, but Zadie saw the way he watched both of them, like a man who'd been given something he never thought to ask for. They married the following Sunday under the cottonwoods near the creek, with only the wind and the water as witness. Zadie wore a dress she'd sewn by hand, and Asher wore the same coat he'd offered her that first winter. There was no preacher, no ring exchanged, just a vow spoken soft and sure, and a kiss that sealed it like truth. Years passed quiet and full. The mending business grew. Neighbors came from farther out, some bringing cloth, others just stories to share beside the fire. Zadie taught women how to dye cloth without wasting water, how to reinforce seams that wouldn't split under snow weight. She kept the collar that had brought her first coin in a small chest, wrapped in muslin. Asher built a larger barn and started raising sheep. He taught Aloan how to guide them gently, how to listen for the shift in their breathing before a storm. She followed him everywhere, quick-footed and curious, her braid always loose by midday. Zadie watched them from the window sometimes, her hand resting over the place where another child now grew, steady and new. One evening, as the sun filtered through the pine, Asher sat on the porch with Aloan in his lap, carving a wooden doll from a block of ash. Zadie stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "You reckon you'll make one for the next?" she asked, nodding toward her belly. He looked up, smiling slow. "Already started." She sat beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. Their hands found each other's without needing to search, fingers lacing together the way they always had, quiet, certain, belonging. And in that wide Wyoming dusk, with the wind soft through the grass and the cabin behind them full of warmth and memory, they sat as a family, love stitched into every corner of their life like the finest, surest seam. Nothing was missing, nothing undone, and nothing ever would be.